January 5, 1943. 09:00 hours. Cape Hunter, southern Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Harold "Red" Cochrane steadied himself against the fire control platform of USS Helena's aft 5-inch battery as the cruiser maneuvered through Iron Bottom Sound. The morning air was thick with humidity and the acrid smell of spent propellant. The ship had just completed a devastating bombardment of Munda airfield, firing 4,000 shells into Japanese positions through the pre-dawn darkness. Gun crews, exhausted from hours at battle stations, worked methodically to recover the ship's floatplanes that had spotted for the bombardment. Most assumed the mission was over. They were wrong. Cochrane had been awake for 26 hours straight. His eyes burned from fatigue and smoke. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the morning breeze. But when the lookout's voice crackled over the intercom, reporting bogies inbound from the northwest, every trace of exhaustion vanished. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had been waiting for this moment since October, when mysterious crates marked "Special Ammunition, Top Secret" had been loaded aboard Helena during her brief respite at Espiritu Santo. Through the haze, 2 dark specks materialized above the northern horizon, growing larger with each second. Aichi D-3, Aval dive bombers, their fixed landing gear giving them the appearance of predatory birds swooping toward prey. Cochrane could see them clearly now through his optics, perhaps 8,000 yards distant and closing fast. The Vals had likely launched from Buin or Buka, seeking targets of opportunity after the night's American bombardment. They had found one. Standard procedure called for time-fused shells, individually adjusted by hand, cranking a mechanism on each shell's nose before loading. Gunners estimated target altitude through optical rangefinders, calculated time to altitude based on shell velocity and trajectory, cranked the fuse setting, loaded, fired, and hoped their mathematics were correct. The entire process took precious seconds per shell. Success rates with these mechanical fuses averaged 1 kill per 2,500 rounds fired. Against maneuvering targets at varying altitudes, the odds approached lottery-level probability. But Helena carried something different this morning. 500 rounds of 5-inch shells tipped with devices so secret that even describing their function to unauthorized personnel warranted court-martial. Commander William Parsons himself had supervised the ammunition's transfer, spending 3 days drilling Helena's officers on handling procedures and security protocols. The shells looked identical to standard high-explosive rounds except for a distinctive cream-colored nose cone instead of the usual dark gray. The proximity fuse, a mechanism containing miniaturized radio, transmitter, receiver, vacuum tubes, and battery packed into a space smaller than a soda bottle, designed to accomplish what seemed physically impossible just 3 years earlier. It would detonate the shell automatically when passing within 70 feet of a target, turning near misses into kills, and expanding the lethal burst radius from 60 square feet to over 3,000 square feet. The physics were elegant in theory, terrifying in practice. The Japanese pilots diving toward Helena had no way of knowing they were about to encounter technology that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of aerial warfare. Warrant Officer Shigeo Nakamura and Flight Petty Officer Kenji Watanabe, both veterans with over a year of combat experience, had survived attacks against American ships at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. They understood American anti-aircraft fire patterns. They knew that if they varied altitude during approach and timed their dives to exploit gaps between shell bursts, survival odds improved significantly. Their experience was about to become obsolete. Cochrane's fire control team tracked the approaching Vals through Mark 37 director optics, range 7,000 yards. Altitude estimated 4,500 feet, closure rate approximately 300 miles per hour. In normal circumstances, Cochrane would order mechanical time fuses set for altitude, then pray the Japanese didn't change their approach pattern. Today, he simply confirmed the special ammunition was loaded and ordered batteries released. The first salvo of 3 shells departed Helena's aft 5-inch mount at 09:02 hours and 17 seconds. The gun's recoil shook the deck. 3 more rounds were already being loaded. The shells climbed toward the valves on ballistic trajectories, spinning at 500 revolutions per second, their internal mechanisms activating as centrifugal force spread battery electrolyte across contact surfaces. Within milliseconds, miniature radio transmitters began broadcasting signals that reflected off everything around them: water, air, metal. Nakamura saw the shell bursts blossom 400 yards to his left and slightly below his altitude. American fire was close but not dangerous if he maintained current heading. He didn't know that each burst created shrapnel patterns extending hundreds of feet in all directions. He didn't know the shells hadn't been aimed at his current position, but at a volume of air his aircraft would occupy 2 seconds later. He didn't know that the second salvo was already in the air, tracking his movement with mechanical precision. Within 90 seconds of the first shots fired, both aircraft were falling from the sky in flames. Nakamura's valve disintegrated when a shell detonated 40 feet from his starboard wing, shrapnel shredding the aircraft's light structure and detonating the bomb still carried under the fuselage. The blast killed him instantly. Watanabe's aircraft, hit by fragments from the third salvo, rolled inverted trailing smoke before plunging into Iron Bottom Sound, 3 miles from Helena. There were no survivors. The gunners had fired approximately 50 rounds total across both salvos. Using conventional ammunition, downing 2 aircraft this quickly would have been statistically miraculous, requiring either incredible luck or Japanese errors so egregious they bordered on suicidal. With proximity fuses, it was routine, mathematically predictable, mechanically repeatable. The shells did exactly what they were designed to do. They found targets within their lethal radius and detonated automatically. Human skill mattered primarily in getting shells into approximate target zones. The fuses handled the precision killing. Cochrane's hands trembled slightly as he logged the engagement in the battery action report. He had fired anti-aircraft ammunition in dozens of engagements since Pearl Harbor. He knew what normal results looked like. 2 aircraft destroyed with 50 rounds wasn't normal. It was revolutionary. He wrote carefully, aware that his report would be read by admirals and perhaps the Secretary of the Navy. VT fuse. Ammunition functioned as briefed. Both targets destroyed. Recommend immediate fleet-wide deployment. That single sentence, buried in an after-action report filed at 0920 hours on January 5, 1943, represented vindication for 2 years of research, $30 million in development costs, and the reputations of hundreds of scientists who had been told their project was impossible. 6 months earlier, on August 12, 1942, scientists and naval officers gathered aboard USS Cleveland in Chesapeake Bay to witness either vindication or catastrophic failure. The light cruiser, freshly commissioned and still on shakedown cruise, had been selected for what might be the most important gunnery test in American naval history. 2 years of research, $30 million in development costs, and the reputation of America's scientific establishment rested on whether 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft would fall from the sky when engaged by Cleveland's 5-inch guns firing shells equipped with the new proximity fuses. The observers included Admiral William Blandy, who had advocated for proximity fuse development since the early 1930s when he was a young gunnery officer with radical ideas about fire control. Dr. Merle Tuve, the physicist who had led Section T's development team, stood on Cleveland's bridge, watching his theoretical calculations transform into operational weapons. Commander William Parsons, the ordnance officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay, supervised the test procedures with characteristic attention to detail. The morning was hot and humid, typical August weather in the Chesapeake. Cleveland's crew had spent the previous day preparing for the test, loading specially marked ammunition and calibrating fire control equipment to exacting specifications. The drones, converted Navy aircraft fitted with radio control systems, would simulate Japanese attack patterns learned from combat reports. They would approach at varying altitudes and angles, maneuvering evasively to create realistic engagement scenarios. At 0800 hours, the first drone launched from Naval Air Station Patuxent River. Controllers flew it toward Cleveland at an altitude of 4,000 feet, speed 180 miles per hour. Cleveland's fire control radar acquired the target at 8,000 yards. The Mark 37 director tracked smoothly, At 6,000 yards, the forward 5-inch mount opened fire. The first shell exploded 200 feet from the drone, close enough to cause visible damage but not a kill. The second shell detonated 70 feet from target. The drone disintegrated, pieces tumbling into the Chesapeake. The observers on Cleveland's bridge stood silent for several seconds. Then someone began clapping. Within moments, the bridge erupted in cheers. Tuve later wrote that he felt lightheaded, as if he might faint from relief. 18-hour days, countless failed prototypes, and skepticism from senior officers who thought the project was scientific fantasy had culminated in a drone falling from the sky in pieces because a shell's internal radio had detected its presence and detonated automatically. The second drone launched at 1,030 hours, approaching from a different angle at higher altitude. Cleveland's guns fired 3 salvos. The drone exploded on the second burst. The third drone, launched at 1,400 hours and flying evasive maneuvers, lasted slightly longer, but met the same fate. 4 bursts from Cleveland's guns destroyed all 3 drones in simulated combat conditions. The test schedule had called for 2 days of extensive evaluation with multiple drones and various engagement scenarios. But the Navy brass, observing from Cleveland's bridge, had seen enough. Admiral Blandy descended to the radio room and drafted a message to the Bureau of Ordnance. Proximity fuse test successful beyond expectations. Recommend immediate authorization for mass production. Request priority allocation of manufacturing resources. The message was classified top secret and transmitted via encrypted channels. Within 72 hours, contracts worth millions of dollars were being signed with industrial manufacturers across the United States. What the observers had witnessed was the culmination of an engineering challenge that most experts had declared impossible just 3 years earlier. The path from theory to working weapon had been tortuous, filled with failures that tested the determination of everyone involved. The proximity fuse emerged from desperation. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, British anti-aircraft batteries fired an estimated 20,000 shells for every German aircraft destroyed. The mathematics were unsustainable. At that rate of consumption, Britain would exhaust ammunition stocks before Germany exhausted aircraft. Something fundamentally better was required. Traditional anti-aircraft shells used mechanical time fuses, essentially miniature clocks that counted seconds after firing before detonating the shell. Gunners estimated target altitude, calculated time to altitude based on shell velocity, hand-cranked the fuse mechanism to the appropriate setting, loaded the shell, fired, and hoped their mathematics were correct. If altitude estimates were off by even 500 feet, shells exploded harmlessly above or below enemy formations. The process was slow, inaccurate, and psychologically devastating to gun crews who watched thousands of their shells burst uselessly while enemy bombers pressed attacks. Fighter pilots complained bitterly that anti-aircraft fire was more spectacular than effective, useful primarily for forcing enemy aircraft to higher altitudes where accuracy suffered. Direct hits against maneuvering aircraft were vanishingly rare. A shell and aircraft had to occupy the same cubic yard of airspace at the same instant. For objects moving at hundreds of miles per hour in 3 dimensions, probability approached 0. The British had explored electronic fuses before the war but made little progress. In summer 1940, facing invasion and nightly bombardment, they shared their research with American scientists through the Tizard mission, a delegation that revealed Britain's most closely guarded technological secrets, including radar development. Among the materials transferred was research on proximity fuses, accompanied by frank admission that British efforts had stalled. Could American science succeed where British efforts had failed? The National Defense Research Committee assigned the problem to Section T, a group led by physicist Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Tuve assembled a team of scientists, engineers, and ordnance specialists who would eventually number in the hundreds. Their mission was straightforward to describe, but seemed impossible to achieve. Create a device, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, robust enough to survive launch forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity, sensitive enough to detect aircraft at 70 feet range, sophisticated enough to transmit radio signals and analyze returns, powered by a battery that activated during flight, and reliable enough to function in combat after enduring extreme acceleration, spin rates of 500 revolutions per second, and temperature variations from -40 to +160 degrees Fahrenheit. Every component violated established engineering principles. Vacuum tubes, the heart of radio technology in 1940, were fragile glass devices that shattered under shock loads exceeding 20 Gs. Artillery shells experienced 20,000 Gs during launch. Batteries capable of powering radio equipment for the seconds required to reach a target were too large to fit inside a 5-inch shell. Even if power and electronics survived launch, the shell's rotation at 500 revolutions per second would make it impossible to aim a radio beam at anything. Early experiments confirmed the pessimism. Test shells fired at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland arrived at target zones as clouds of shattered glass and twisted metal. The electronic components disintegrated during launch. Even shells that survived firing failed when battery electrolyte sloshed during acceleration, breaking electrical connections. The project seemed doomed before beginning. Tuve's team attacked each problem systematically. For vacuum tubes, they partnered with Sylvania to develop miniaturized versions using thicker glass and reinforced filaments. Standard radio tubes measured several inches in length. The new tubes had to fit within a space measured in fractions of an inch while retaining full functionality. Engineers experimented with dozens of designs, subjecting prototypes to impacts in custom-built testing machines that simulated artillery launch forces. The breakthrough came with development of tubes so small they appeared impossible. The complete assembly, 5 tubes performing transmitter, receiver, and amplification functions, occupied less space than a cigarette pack. Each tube was precision manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Quality control rejected any tube with visible imperfections. Even microscopic cracks would cause failure under launch forces. The battery problem required equally creative solutions. Conventional batteries used liquid electrolyte that would spill during the violent launch. Engineers developed a dry electrolyte system that remained inert until activation. But how to activate a battery inside a spinning, accelerating shell traveling at 2,600 feet per second? The solution was elegant. Centrifugal force from the shell's rotation would spread powdered electrolyte across contact surfaces, completing the circuit and providing power within milliseconds of launch. The radio system presented unique challenges. The device couldn't use directional antennas that had to point at targets. Solution was to use the shell's metal casing as an omnidirectional antenna, broadcasting in all directions. The transmitter sent continuous radio signals. When these signals reflected from aircraft, the receiver detected the return. As distance decreased, return signal strength increased. At approximately 70 feet separation, signal strength crossed a threshold, triggering the detonator. This principle meant the fuse was most effective against the largest cross-section targets, aircraft approaching head-on or broadside. It was least effective against aircraft at extreme angles or very high speeds that passed through the trigger zone too quickly. But even imperfect function exceeded conventional fuses by orders of magnitude. A proximity fuse might fail to detonate against 10% of targets. Conventional fuses failed against 98% of targets. By early 1942, Section T had functional prototypes. The team established the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University to oversee development and manufacturing coordination. The project was classified top secret, with code word access restrictions more stringent than radar or sonar development. Participants signed documents acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure carried penalties, including execution. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The security measures reflected genuine concern. If Germany or Japan captured intact proximity, fuses, and reverse-engineered them, Allied bombers would face devastation. German anti-aircraft batteries already shot down significant numbers of American and British bombers using conventional ammunition. With proximity fuses, Luftwaffe could potentially make strategic bombing unsustainable. The technology had to be protected at all costs. Manufacturing presented challenges, rivaling the technical development. Each fuse contained approximately 130 components, many requiring precision machining. The devices had to be mass-produced in quantities reaching thousands daily, while maintaining quality standards that allowed zero defects. A single malfunctioning component could cause premature detonation, destroying the gun and killing the crew. The Navy contracted with Crosley Corporation of Cincinnati, Ohio, primarily known for manufacturing radios and refrigerators. Crosley's engineering expertise in mass-producing electronic devices made them ideal for proximity fuse production. Lewis Clement, Crosley's vice president for engineering, later recalled receiving the contract in late October 1941 with instructions that the project was top secret, top priority, and required immediate action. Crosley delivered their first accepted fuses in September 1942. Initial production was painfully slow, perhaps 500 units daily, but the manufacturing process improved rapidly. By late 1943, daily production exceeded 40,000 fuses from multiple contractors including RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Ultimately, 87 firms operating 110 factories participated in some phase of production. The industrial achievement was staggering. Each fuse cost $732 in 1942, equivalent to purchasing a small automobile. By 1945, through mass production efficiencies, cost had dropped to $18 per unit. Total wartime production exceeded 22 million fuses, at total cost of approximately $1 billion, equal to roughly $15 billion in modern currency. Quality control was obsessive. Applied physics laboratory inspectors visited every factory monthly, examining production processes, testing random samples, and shutting down facilities that failed to meet specifications. Several contractors were closed temporarily when defect rates exceeded acceptable limits. The Navy's minimum acceptable reliability threshold was 50% functionality. In practice, by 1944, operational reliability exceeded 70%, meaning 7 of every 10 proximity-fused shells detonated correctly near targets. The first combat shipment, 5,000 rounds carefully packed and accompanied by Commander William Parsons, departed for the Pacific in late 1942. Parsons, who would later achieve fame arming the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay, personally trained gun crews aboard Helena, Enterprise, and Saratoga in handling the new ammunition. Security protocols were extraordinary. Shells were stored in locked magazines accessible only to officers with specific authorization. Gun crews were forbidden from discussing the ammunition's existence. Any dud rounds had to be recovered if possible, or their splashdown coordinates reported immediately, so salvage teams could prevent enemy recovery. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Pacific forces, recognized the significance immediately. He assigned the new ammunition to ships most likely to come under air attack. Helena, operating in the Solomons where Japanese air attacks occurred almost daily, was obvious choice. The cruiser had survived Pearl Harbor with torpedo damage, returned to service after extensive repairs, and compiled impressive combat record at Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal. Her gun crews were veteran, disciplined, and reliable, perfect for field testing revolutionary technology. The engagement off Guadalcanal on January 5 proved the system worked, but one successful demonstration wasn't sufficient validation. The technology needed testing against varied attack angles, multiple aircraft simultaneously, and combat conditions including darkness, adverse weather, and damaged equipment. Throughout early 1943, every engagement where proximity-fused shells were fired generated detailed after-action reports documenting fuse performance, failures, and lessons learned. Analysis revealed the fuse was most effective at ranges between 2,000 and 5,000 yards, where shells had time to arm after launch, but aircraft closing speeds still provided adequate reaction time. Against dive bombers attacking nearly vertically, effectiveness was reduced because aircraft passed through the trigger zone so rapidly. Against torpedo bombers approaching at low altitude over water, effectiveness was exceptional because the water surface provided strong radar returns, enhancing detection. Statisticians compiled the numbers. In 1943, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. Though only 25% used proximity fuses, these accounted for 51% of kills. The shells had lethal fragment area of 3,000 square feet compared to 60 square feet for conventional shells. Success rates were so dramatic that by late 1943, the Navy specified proximity fuses for 75% of anti-aircraft ammunition. But the Pentagon remained adamant that proximity fuses could not be used over land territories where duds might be recovered by enemy forces. This restriction frustrated Navy commanders whose ships supported amphibious landings. They could see that proximity-fused shells devastating beach defenses with airburst effects would save American lives. But fear of technology compromise overrode tactical advantages. For over a year, proximity fuses remained exclusively naval weapons, used only over open ocean, where duds would sink beyond enemy reach. The restriction began to crack in June 1944, when Germany launched V-1 flying bomb attacks against London. The cruise missiles flew low and fast, exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitudes around 2,000 feet. Fighter interception was difficult. Conventional anti-aircraft fire was nearly useless. In the first weeks of attacks, German launched 9,300 Von second at an average of 120 per day. British and American anti-aircraft guns destroyed only 17% using time-fused shells. The combined Chiefs of Staff authorized limited use of proximity fuses by anti-aircraft guns positioned along England's southeastern coast, where duds would fall into the English Channel beyond German recovery capability. Results were immediate and spectacular. Within 4 weeks, kill rates climbed to 79%. The fuses saved London from potentially catastrophic damage. As one British officer reported to Applied Physics Laboratory, the VT fuse has saved thousands of lives here. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the proximity fuse's defining moment in naval combat. The engagement, which would become known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented Japan's final attempt to achieve the decisive naval victory that had eluded them since Midway. The Japanese committed nearly all remaining carrier aviation in a desperate gamble to destroy American invasion forces at Saipan. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with approximately 430 aircraft, every available trained pilot, and the hope that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome American material advantages. It was a hope built on delusion. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 countered with 15 carriers deploying over 900 aircraft, plus 7 fast battleships and multiple cruiser-destroyer groups equipped with the most advanced anti-aircraft defenses ever assembled. Every 5-inch gun in the fleet was supplied with proximity-fused ammunition. Every ship mounted the latest radar fire control equipment. Every fire direction center was manned by crews trained specifically to coordinate defensive fires against massed air attacks. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Japanese launched 4 massive airstrikes against the American fleet. Ozawa believed that American carriers would be forced to maneuver into wind to launch and recover aircraft, limiting their defensive mobility. He calculated that Japanese aircraft, which had longer range than American planes, could attack from distances where American fighters couldn't effectively intercept. He was gambling that one devastating strike could cripple enough American carriers to turn the campaign's momentum. What the Japanese encountered instead was a defensive system so sophisticated it seemed almost unfair. Long-range radar detected the first incoming raid at 130 miles distance, providing nearly 30 minutes of warning. Fighter directors aboard ships vectored over 200 Hellcat fighters to intercept Japanese formations 60 miles from their targets. Those aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen faced curtains of anti-aircraft fire from ships that didn't need direct hits to kill. Lieutenant Zenji Abe led a section of 9 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers in the second wave. He was a veteran pilot with over 800 flight hours and combat experience dating to the Aleutians campaign. He understood American tactics, knew their defensive capabilities, had survived attacks against American ships on 3 previous occasions. Everything he knew was about to become obsolete. Abe's formation approached the American fleet at an altitude of 8,000 feet, preparing to descend for torpedo runs against what they hoped would be carriers. American radar tracked them from 80 miles out. F-6F Hellcats intercepted them at 40 miles, destroying 3 bombers before Abe could take evasive action. He ordered his remaining aircraft to scatter and descend, hoping to confuse American radar and make it below the fighter screen. 4 more bombers fell to Hellcats during the descent. Abe and his wingman, Flight Petty Officer Takeshi Maeda, survived by diving nearly vertically and leveling out at wave-top altitude. They were now 12 miles from the American fleet, close enough to see the distinctive silhouettes of carriers and battleships. Abe armed his torpedo and began his attack run, approaching at 300 knots, barely 30 feet above the water. This was the attack profile he had trained for, had executed successfully against American transports off Guadalcanal. At this altitude, American radar couldn't track him effectively. American fighters would have difficulty making gun runs without risking ocean impact. He had perhaps 90 seconds before reaching torpedo drop range. Then the American anti-aircraft fire began. Not random bursts scattered across the sky, but concentrated patterns that seemed to track his aircraft specifically. Shells exploded above him, beside him, behind him, creating overlapping zones of shrapnel that made continued flight mathematically impossible. He didn't understand how American gunners were hitting targets they couldn't possibly see through optical sights at this range, altitude. He didn't know that radar fire control directors were tracking his aircraft continuously, calculating future position, and transmitting firing solutions to gun mounts automatically. A 5-inch shell from the battleship USS Alabama detonated 60 feet from Abe's aircraft. Shrapnel shredded his starboard wing and punctured the fuel tank. The torpedo bomber rolled left, struck the ocean surface at 300 knots, and disintegrated. Abe died without understanding what had killed him. Maeda's aircraft, hit by fragments from the same burst, staggered another mile before secondary explosions tore it apart. Neither pilot released their torpedoes, neither came within effective range of American ships. This scene repeated across dozens of separate engagements throughout June 19th. The slaughter was systematic, mechanical, and comprehensive. Of the first wave of 69 aircraft, 42 were destroyed before reaching American ships. The survivors attacked with desperate courage but achieved minimal results. One bomb hit USS South Dakota's main turret, causing minor damage and killing 27 sailors. That single hit was the sum total of Japanese success from the first wave. The second wave of 109 aircraft was detected 90 miles out and intercepted by over 70 Hellcats. 97 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The survivors scattered, some attempting to reach Guam where they believed friendly airfields offered refuge. Most crashed attempting to land with battle damage, or were destroyed by American fighters patrolling the approaches. The third wave, 47 aircraft, was dispersed by navigational errors before reaching targets. 7 were destroyed by American fighters. The remainder became lost, running out of fuel and ditching at sea. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, represented Ozawa's final reserve. These pilots were less experienced than those sent in earlier waves. Some had barely 200 flight hours. They had been held back specifically to exploit any American vulnerabilities revealed by the initial strikes. But there were no vulnerabilities. American defenses had not been degraded. If anything, gun crews were performing more efficiently as they gained experience with actual targets versus training exercises. The fourth wave was intercepted 70 miles from American ships and destroyed piecemeal by Hellcats, operating with complete tactical freedom. By 1600 hours, when the final Japanese aircraft limped back toward Ozawa's carriers, the day's accounting was complete. Of 430 aircraft launched, 329 were destroyed. American losses totaled 23 aircraft, mostly operational accidents rather than combat losses. American pilots, returning to their carriers, coined the nickname that would define the battle. "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home," one pilot remarked during debriefing. The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The phrase captured both the one-sided nature of the slaughter and the casual confidence of American forces who had transformed aerial combat into mechanical process. Official records meticulously documented the proximity fuse's contribution. Although proximity-fused shells represented only 25% of ammunition fired, they accounted for over 50% of Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. Statisticians calculated that 5-inch guns firing conventional time-fused shells required approximately 1,000 rounds per aircraft destroyed. With proximity fuses, the figure dropped to approximately 250 rounds. The effectiveness improvement was 4-to-1, possibly higher considering that many proximity-fused shells scored kills on aircraft already damaged by conventional ammunition. Captain Toshio Ota, a Japanese technical intelligence officer who examined captured American equipment after the war, later wrote detailed analyses that survived in Japanese archives. His assessment was brutally honest. Examining a proximity fuse removed from a crashed American shell recovered in the Philippines, Ota documented findings that induced profound despair among Japanese engineers. The miniaturized vacuum tubes required precision glasswork beyond Japanese capabilities. The battery activation mechanism was ingeniously simple in concept, but required manufacturing tolerances Japanese industry could not maintain. The radio components utilized frequency selection techniques that Japanese electronics could not replicate. Most devastating was Ota's conclusion about manufacturing. Every component demonstrated quality control, suggesting automated testing and rejection of defective units. American industry was apparently producing these devices in quantities that required sophisticated production management. Even had Japan obtained complete fuse designs in 1942, Ota wrote, Japanese industry lacked the capacity to produce them in meaningful quantities. The industrial chasm between Japan and America was not merely technological, it was systemic, reflecting fundamental differences in manufacturing philosophy and organizational capability. But the Battle of the Philippine Sea revealed something more ominous for Japan. The combination of proximity fuses, radar fire control, and vast ammunition supplies meant conventional aerial attacks against American naval forces had become nearly suicidal. Japanese pilots with months of training were being killed by systems so efficient they reduced aerial combat to mechanical slaughter. The human courage that had carried Japanese aviation through early war victories was being made irrelevant by American technology and industrial capacity. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, received the battle reports with growing horror. Of 430 aircraft launched, 329 were destroyed. 2 carriers were sunk by submarine attack during the battle. The mobile fleet that was supposed to destroy American invasion forces had been shattered without achieving any significant damage to enemy ships. This was Japan's carefully planned decisive battle, the engagement that was supposed to turn the war's momentum. Instead, it demonstrated that Japan could no longer contest control of the sea or sky against American forces. Some historians argue that the proximity fuse's effectiveness contributed directly to Japan's adoption of kamikaze tactics in October 1944. The reasoning was brutal but logical. If conventional attacks resulted in 90% casualties without achieving damage, perhaps suicide attacks that guaranteed 100% casualties might achieve proportionally greater damage. A pilot determined to crash his aircraft into a ship would press the attack through defensive fire that would have turned back conventional attackers. The proximity fuse that made conventional bombing nearly impossible might be less effective against aircraft already ablaze, but continuing toward targets. The mathematics of kamikaze attacks were debated within Japanese naval aviation headquarters throughout summer 1944. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, senior staff officer for 1st Air Fleet, compiled statistical analyses showing that conventional attacks off the Philippines cost 3 to 10 aircraft per ship damaged. Kamikaze attacks, pressed home with fanatical determination, might reverse that ratio to 1 aircraft per ship damaged. Even accounting for certain pilot death, the exchange would favor Japan if American fleet movements could be disrupted. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. 73 aircraft were expended in suicide attacks, sinking 1 escort carrier and damaging several other ships. The tactic achieved greater results per aircraft than conventional attacks had managed in months. Japanese commanders, trapped in a strategic situation, allowing no good choices, embraced kamikaze as perhaps the only method offering hope of inflicting significant American casualties. But even kamikaze attacks faced the proximity fuse's effectiveness. The destroyers USS Hadley and USS Evans demonstrated this on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. 156 kamikaze aircraft attacked the two ships and 4 landing craft over 90 minutes. The ship's 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed dozens of attackers. Although both destroyers were eventually hit by aircraft already ablaze from defensive fire, the gun crews had eliminated most attackers before impact. Hadley's guns alone destroyed an estimated 23 aircraft. Evans accounted for 33. The official report described the horizon as filled with burning Japanese planes, too many to count accurately. The battle reports from Okinawa documented proximity, fuse effectiveness even against the most determined attacks. Analysis showed that 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused shells remained the most effective weapons against kamikazes, far superior to 40mm or 20mm guns that relied on direct hits. The fuse's ability to detonate near targets meant that even aircraft that passed through defensive fire while damaged could be destroyed before reaching ships. Yet kamikaze attacks succeeded often enough to validate Japanese tactical desperation. At Okinawa, suicide attacks sank 21 American ships and damaged 66 others. Thousands of American sailors died in attacks that proximity fuses and advanced fire control could slow but not entirely prevent. The fanatical determination of pilots willing to die guaranteed that some percentage would break through defensive fire, and a single aircraft could inflict catastrophic damage if it struck a ship's vulnerable areas. The proximity fuse's effectiveness raised troubling questions about modern warfare. Technology had created situations where courage became insufficient. Japanese pilots, trained from childhood to value honor and sacrifice above survival, found their willingness to die made strategically meaningless by systems that destroyed them at distances where individual skill was irrelevant. American sailors, manning gun directors and fire control equipment, killed hundreds of enemy pilots who never came close enough for personal confrontation. This was warfare reduced to mathematics and engineering. Superiority in manufacturing determined who produced more shells. Superiority in electronics determined whose shells exploded at optimal moments. Superiority in industrial organization determined whose supply chains delivered ammunition in required quantities. The human element, courage and sacrifice and individual heroism persisted but had become subordinate to technological and industrial factors. In December 1944, the proximity fuse finally was authorized for use by ground forces in Europe. The catalyst was Germany's Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, which threatened to overwhelm American forces through surprise and mass. General Dwight Eisenhower demanded immediate authorization to use proximity fuses in artillery shells. The Pentagon, recognizing the crisis, lifted restrictions on December 21. The effect on German forces was catastrophic. Artillery shells that exploded 20 to 50 feet above ground showered troops with shrapnel in patterns that trenches and foxholes could not protect against. German infantry had learned to survive conventional artillery by taking cover in any depression or shelter. Proximity-fused shells detonated above these positions, killing or wounding troops who would have survived conventional barrages. Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group defending Monschau, had received proximity-fused shells days before official authorization. When German forces attacked on December 16th, he made the decision to use them without waiting for permission. His batteries fired hundreds of rounds equipped with the new fuses, stopping the German attack with devastating effectiveness. German survivors reported that the artillery seemed uncannily accurate, finding them even in covered positions. General George Patton, commanding Third Army, was effusive in his assessment. In a letter to the War Department, he wrote that the proximity fuse was devastating. His artillery had caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River and killed 702 soldiers by actual count, using concentrated proximity-fused fire. Patton stated that when all armies obtained this shell, new methods of warfare would need to be devised to counter its effectiveness. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Infantry, who had survived years of combat, found themselves unable to hide from artillery that exploded overhead. Some German units experienced near mutinies when soldiers refused orders to leave bunkers during American artillery barrages. The terror of being killed by explosions that found them regardless of cover was more than many could endure. From December 1944 through Germany's surrender in May 1945, American artillery firing proximity-fused shells dominated the battlefield. Allied forces fired hundreds of thousands of shells equipped with fuses that turned every artillery piece into an area denial weapon of unprecedented lethality. German commanders who had planned tactics assuming conventional artillery found their assumptions made obsolete by technology they had attempted to develop themselves but failed to perfect. German scientists had researched proximity fuses extensively. Documents captured after the war revealed that more than 30 different fuse designs had been developed or studied for anti-aircraft use. These included acoustic fuses, triggered by engine sound, electrostatic fuses based on detecting electrical fields generated by aircraft, and radio fuses similar to American designs. Several prototypes were tested at Kummersdorf, proving grounds with promising results, but German production never advanced beyond experimental stages. The technology required manufacturing precision, component miniaturization, and quality control systems that German war industry, operating under Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not sustain. The project, designated Kuhglock for 128mm shells, was scheduled for production in March 1945 but never reached operational status. Had Germany successfully deployed proximity fuses in 1943 or early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against German industry might have become unsustainable. American and British bomber losses were already significant, using conventional German anti-aircraft defenses. Air Force General Sam Phillips stated in a 1988 interview that if Germany had perfected proximity fuses well before war's end, the outcome could have been significantly affected. The proximity fuse stands as one of World War II's most decisive technological achievements, alongside radar and atomic weapons. Its development demonstrates how theoretical impossibility can be overcome through systematic engineering, adequate resources, and organizational focus. It showcases American industrial capacity at peak efficiency, turning laboratory prototypes into mass-produced weapons within months. More significantly, the proximity fuse changed fundamental calculations of warfare. It demonstrated that technology could create advantages so overwhelming that courage and sacrifice became insufficient to achieve military objectives. Japanese pilots willing to die for their country discovered their determination made irrelevant by shells that destroyed them automatically. German infantry trained to endure artillery found their training useless against weapons that made no place safe. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners. The proximity fuse established precedent for guided weapons, smart munitions, and automated defensive systems that dominate modern warfare. The principle that weapons should adjust their behavior based on target detection rather than pre-programmed settings became foundational to military technology development. Yet the proximity fuse's effectiveness also raised questions that remain unresolved. Is there place for human courage in warfare dominated by automated systems? Can individual skill matter when weapons track and destroy targets faster than human reaction permits? Does efficiency in killing diminish the humanity of those who employ such weapons? These questions were particularly acute for those who witnessed the proximity fuse's effects firsthand. American gunners who manned fire control directors watched their shells destroy Japanese aircraft automatically, reducing aerial combat to mechanical process. Japanese pilots who survived attacks against American ships described the overwhelming sense of helplessness, knowing that American defensive fire would find them regardless of skill or determination. The technology fundamentally altered naval warfare. Anti-aircraft gunnery evolved from art requiring exceptional skill and luck to science based on statistics and probability. Gun crews no longer aimed at specific aircraft hoping for direct hits. They fired into areas where radar indicated aircraft were present, trusting that proximity fuses would detonate when shells passed near targets. Success became matter of firing sufficient volume into correct positions. This transformation was evident in ammunition consumption rates. Helena's destruction of 2 aircraft with 50 rounds on January 5, 1943, would have been considered miraculous using conventional ammunition. By late 1944, such efficiency was routine. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition expected kill rates approaching 1 aircraft per 250 rounds, fired 20 times better than conventional ammunition achieved. The industrial achievement was equally significant. Manufacturing 22 million proximity fuses, while maintaining 70% functionality, required coordination of hundreds of factories, quality control across entire supply chains, and testing procedures that identified defective components before reaching combat. This organizational capability demonstrated advantages extending beyond specific weapons to entire systems of war production. Japan recognized these advantages but could not replicate them. Japanese scientists understood proximity fuse principles. Captured American shells were examined exhaustively by Japanese technical intelligence. Engineers documented manufacturing techniques, component specifications, and theoretical operational parameters. But possessing knowledge was insufficient. Manufacturing the devices required industrial infrastructure, precision equipment, quality materials, and organizational systems that Japan's war-damaged economy could not provide. Captain Toshio Ota's post-war writings captured Japanese engineers' frustration. They understood what needed to be done. They could visualize how components functioned together. They knew which materials were required. But translating understanding into production exceeded Japanese capabilities. Even had complete manufacturing specifications been provided in 1942, Ota concluded, Japan lacked foundries capable of producing proper alloys, machine tools precise enough for component manufacture, and testing equipment necessary for quality control. This industrial disparity became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. American factories produced not only proximity fuses but thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, millions of shells, and all support equipment required to employ these weapons effectively. Japanese industry struggled to maintain existing equipment, much less expand production. The gap wasn't merely technological, it was systemic, reflecting fundamental differences in industrial organization, resource availability, and manufacturing philosophy. The proximity fuse embodied these differences. Its development required willingness to invest resources in uncertain research, confidence that manufacturing challenges could be overcome through systematic engineering, and coordination between universities, private industry, and military organizations. These were strengths of American system, but weaknesses of Japanese approach that emphasized centralized control, resource conservation, and incremental improvement over revolutionary development. By summer 1945, proximity fuses had achieved what they were designed to accomplish. Japanese aircraft attacking American ships faced defensive fire so accurate that conventional attacks were tactical suicide. German forces subjected to American artillery bombardment found no protection from shells that exploded overhead. The V-1 flying bombs that terrorized London were being destroyed in percentages that made their use strategically futile. Technology had created defensive capabilities that conventional offensive tactics could not overcome. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki overshadowed the proximity fuse in historical memory. Nuclear weapons were dramatic, visually spectacular, and politically significant. But the proximity fuse arguably contributed more to Allied victory through cumulative effects across thousands of engagements over 3 years. It saved London from V-1 devastation. It protected Allied forces during D-Day landings and subsequent European campaigns. It made Japanese naval aviation unsustainable and American amphibious operations feasible. It accomplished these achievements through mathematics and engineering rather than revolutionary physics. Ralph Baldwin, one of the scientists who worked on fuse development, later wrote that in his opinion, the proximity fuse was the real secret weapon of World War II. While lacking the atomic bomb's awesome power or radar's broad applications, the fuse was equally crucial to Allied victory. It changed warfare's fundamental equations, demonstrating that technological superiority could overcome numerical or positional advantages. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.